Basically, what ended up being played in court was 4K footage of the King Von death from both angles that had never been seen before. Same footage, but way more detail and longer. Now, what I learned from watching that footage that I had never seen before.
Lil Durk breaks down in court as prosecutors show the video of King Von's last words. That moment hit the courtroom with a weight that stopped everything cold. And in a trial already carrying more emotional history than almost any federal case hip-hop has ever seen, that is saying something unbelievable. What King Von said before he died is now at the center of this case in ways the public never saw coming. Stay with us, because the story of how one night in 2020 became the most powerful weapon in this federal trial cuts deeper than anything this case has shown the jury so far. Yo, what's good, fam? Today we're breaking down the emotional courtroom moment that brought King Von's last words back into the open, and how the defense is using that night in Atlanta to build an entirely different story about what happened in Los Angeles 2 years later. Let's get into it. To understand why that moment in the courtroom carried the weight that it did, you have to understand what King Von Bennett was not simply another artist on the Only the Family roster. He was one of the closest people in Durk's life. They grew up connected through Chicago's Inglewood neighborhood, shared history that went back years before either of them had a recording contract, and built a professional relationship that was inseparable from a personal one. Von was one of the most naturally gifted storytellers to come out of Chicago drill, capable of constructing narratives in his music with a specificity and cinematic detail that set him apart from almost everyone around him. He was on the trajectory of becoming one of the defining voices of his generation. His relationship with Lil Durk gave OTF one of its most compelling identities. Two artists from the same world who brought out different dimensions of each other's music and whose combined presence made the label feel like a genuine movement rather than a business arrangement. When King Von died, that was not just a professional loss for Lil Durk. It was a personal devastation. The kind of loss that does not process cleanly or move through stages the way grief is supposed to. The kind that sits in the body and changes how you see everything that comes after. Von had been building towards something enormous. His storytelling ability, his delivery, and his raw authenticity had earned him a fan base that was growing faster than almost any other artist in the space. His death at 26 did not just remove a person from the world. It removed a trajectory, a future catalog, a generation of music that will never exist. For Lil Durk, who had watched Von develop from inside the closest possible proximity, that absence was not abstract. It was daily. It was in the music he made after, in the interviews he gave, and in the way he carried himself publicly in the months that followed. Now let's go back to the night it happened. November 6, 2020, outside the Monaco Hookah Lounge in Atlanta, Georgia. King Von and his crew spotted Quando Rondo outside the venue. Video evidence showed Von aggressively approaching Quando Rondo and throwing punches, putting himself right in the middle of that brawl. Then, things turned deadly fast. Quando Rondo's close associate Timothy Leaks, known as Lil Tim, stepped forward, pulled out a firearm, and shot King Von multiple times. Von was rushed to an Atlanta hospital in critical condition and later died from his injuries. He was 26 years old. Lil Tim was arrested and charged with murder, but here's where it gets real. Those charges were eventually dropped under Georgia's Stand Your Ground self-defense laws. For everyone connected to Von, that was a second wound on top of the first. The courts closed the door and delivered nothing. The aftermath of Von's death placed Lil Durk and OTF at the center of an enormous and very public pressure. Social media was immediate and relentless. Fan expectations, street culture dynamics, and the visibility of everyone involved meant that the question of retaliation was not being asked quietly. It was being demanded loudly on every platform by people who saw Von's death as something that required a response. Prosecutors in this trial have argued that Durk felt that pressure acutely. They have introduced evidence that he was aware of the public perception that OTF had not responded, and that this awareness became part of the emotional architecture behind what they allege happened next. But here's where the trial took a turn that nobody on the outside fully expected. Let me break down for y'all what the defense did with King Von's final moments. because this is where the case gets genuinely complicated. Now let me break down for y'all exactly what happened in that courtroom on day 2, because the way this story spread online is not entirely accurate. The viral claim going around is that prosecutors showed a video of King Von's last words and Lil Durk broke down watching it. But here is where we got to separate fact from fiction. It was actually the defense, not the prosecution, that brought King Von's final words before that jury. During cross-examination of investigators, Durk's legal team revealed what Von said in his dying moments as part of a calculated counter-strategy against one of the government's most important witnesses. That distinction changes everything about who is wielding the most emotional evidence in this trial and why. According to the defense's presentation in court, King Von's last coherent interaction before he died was directed at someone specific. He looked toward Kavon Grant, known as OTF Vonnie, his close associate and cousin, and asked a question that the defense says the jury needs to sit with. He asked why Grant had let him get shot. That question, directed at Grant and Von's final moments, became the foundation of one of the most strategically significant arguments Lil Durk's defense team has made throughout this entire trial. The reason that question matters is what the defense has built around it. They have argued that Von and Grant were not simply associates or label connections. They lived together. They shared a joint bank account. Their relationship was intimate in the way that only people who have genuinely trusted each other completely can claim. And in that context, Von's final question was not a random dying statement. According to the defense, it was a direct accusation, a moment where Von, in his last moments, pointed toward Grant and assigned responsibility. Whether you interpret that as an accusation of cowardice, a statement about positioning during the shooting, or something more specific, the defense wants the jury thinking about Grant's relationship to that night in a way that prosecutors have not framed it. And the reason that framing matters so much is that Kavon Grant is one of the central cooperating witnesses in this federal case. He has pleaded guilty and agreed to testify for the prosecution against Lil Durk. So the defense is doing something very deliberate here. They are using King Von's own final words to plant a seed of doubt about the credibility and motives of one of the government's most important witnesses. If the jury questions Grant, even slightly, it affects the weight they give to everything he tells them about the alleged murder-for-hire operation. That is not an accident. That is precision legal strategy wrapped around one of the most emotionally devastating moments in this entire story. Now here's how that single night in 2020 connects directly to why Lil Durk is sitting in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles right now. The government's entire case hinges on proving that what happened outside that hookah lounge triggered a relentless, multi-state conspiracy that Durk organized and financed from the top. FBI agent Jaron Farnby took the stand and read text logs pulled directly from Durk's devices from the hours right after Von was killed. In those texts, Durk told a close associate he felt dead inside. But hours later, those same texts show Durk sending surveillance footage of the fight directly to associates with messages about get back and retaliation. Prosecutors are not reading those texts as grief. They are reading them as the beginning of a plan. Then there is the Pissed Me Off music video, which prosecutors successfully argued to the judge was not just art but a literal call to arms directed at OTF to go after anyone connected to Von's death. And then the feds draw a straight line from November 2020 all the way to August 2022, when a 5-man hit squad was flown to Los Angeles to track down Quando Rondo. That tracking ended at a gas station shooting near the Beverly Center. Quando survived, but his cousin Xavier Robinson, known as Lou Pab, was shot through the torso and killed. The prosecution is asking this jury to see all of it. The text, the music, the ambush, as one continuous premeditated campaign of revenge that started the night King Von took his last breath. But here's where it gets interesting. The defense does not dispute that Lil Durk was devastated by Von's death. They are not arguing that he was indifferent or unaffected. What they are arguing is that feeling grief and loss does not make someone the architect of a murder-for-hire conspiracy. Grief is not evidence of a crime. And the gap between emotional devastation in November 2020 and alleged organized retaliation operation in August 2022 is a gap the defense intends to keep as wide as possible in the jury's mind. Prosecutors have also introduced digital material showing what members of Durk's circle were discussing and sharing in the days and weeks after Von's death. Surveillance footage, messages, and other digital records have been used to reconstruct the atmosphere inside OTF, following the shooting. The government's argument is that the conversations and communications from that period show an environment where retaliation was not just expected, but actively discussed. Among people connected to Durk, investigators have presented these communications as evidence of a sustained and coordinated emotional and organizational response to Von's death, rather than simply individuals expressing private grief. The defense argues that discussions are not plans, that expressing anger after losing a close friend and colleague is not the same as organizing a murder, and that the government is reading criminal conspiracy into conversations that reflect the ordinary and human response to an extraordinary loss. That distinction between grieving and planning is one the jury will have to draw for themselves based on the specific content of what was actually said in those messages. Then there is the music. Prosecutors successfully argued for the admission of Lil Durk's Piss Me Off music video as trial evidence. The government's interpretation of portions of the song connects it to the emotional and retaliatory themes they say were present in Durk's life following Von's death. A visual element of the video involves imagery connected to Von Durk, wearing a chain with Von's nickname V-Roy, a shirt bearing Von's image, and audio of Von spliced into the track. Government witnesses have been prepared to testify about the environment where the video was filmed and its connection to the gang structure. Prosecutors say Durk used to build OTF. For the prosecution, the video is not just a music release. It is an artifact of the mental state they are trying to document. The defense has pushed back on this directly, and their argument matters beyond just this trial. They are raising a question that courts have been wrestling with increasingly across the country. When can a rapper's lyrics be introduced as evidence of criminal intent? The defense argues that rap music is an artistic medium that uses exaggeration, fictional persona, metaphor, and stylized violence as storytelling tools. A song about revenge or retaliation does not automatically describe a real plan. A lyric that expresses anger does not constitute a confession. The defense is asking the jury to evaluate the music within a context of artistic expression, rather than treating it as a literal account of Lil Durk's intentions. That disagreement over how to read a piece of music in a courtroom is one of the most culturally significant legal questions this trial is producing. Now, let's talk about Kavon Grant more specifically, because his position in this case is genuinely unusual. Grant is being used by the prosecution as a cooperating witness. He has pleaded guilty and is expected to testify about what he knows regarding the alleged murder-for-hire operation. But the defense is simultaneously pointing at Grant as the person who may have been responsible for the Los Angeles operation without Lil Durk's knowledge or authorization. The defense has argued that Grant used business resources connected to astronaut sounds and other company accounts to facilitate elements of the alleged operation, and that he did so on his own initiative without direction from Durk. That puts Grant in an extraordinary position within the trial. He is simultaneously one of the government's most important witnesses and the primary alternative suspect the defense is presenting to the jury. And the defense's use of King Von's dying question directed specifically at Grant is designed to make the jury see Grant's relationship to the original tragedy in a fundamentally different way than prosecutors have presented it. The defense is not simply attacking Grant's credibility as a witness in the routine way defense attorneys attack cooperating witnesses in federal trials. They are arguing that Grant had a deeper, more personal connection to the events of November 2020 than the government's narrative acknowledges. That he was present on the night Von died. That he shared a life with Von in the way that people who are genuinely close do. And that his presence in the middle of this story is not coincidental, but central. The defense wants the jury to ask whether the person with the most intimate relationship to King Von's death is the defendant sitting at the table or the witness about to take the stand. This is where the cooperating witness issue becomes absolutely central to understanding this trial. The defense has aggressively challenged the reliability of the government's cooperating witnesses across the board. Brian Steele, Lil Durk's lead defense attorney, has used the interview numbers to hammer this point in front of the jury. OTF Jam was interviewed approximately 30 times by investigators, but only 3 of those sessions were recorded. OTF Vonnie was interviewed approximately 10 times with none of those meetings recorded. Flacco was interviewed approximately 15 times with only 1 recorded session. Steele forced investigators to acknowledge these numbers on the stand, and the implications are significant. When someone is interviewed 30 times without recording, the question of whether their account stayed consistent, evolved under pressure, or was shaped by what investigators wanted to hear cannot be answered by the documentation that exists. That is not a minor detail. In a case where cooperating witness testimony is central to the prosecution's theory, the absence of recordings from the vast majority of those sessions is a structural vulnerability that Steele is exploiting with precision. Prosecutors respond to this challenge by pointing to the corroborating evidence that exists independently of witness testimony. Digital records do not change their stories between interviews. Financial transactions happen or they did not. Flight manifests either show travel or they do not. Surveillance footage captures what it captures. The government's argument is that the cooperating witnesses are not the only foundation of the case. They are one layer of a structure that includes documentary and digital evidence capable of standing on its own. Whether the jury finds that argument sufficient is one of the central questions that will determine the verdict. Let the full timeline sink in for a minute. November 2020, King Von is killed outside a hookah lounge in Atlanta. Lil Tim is charged and later the case is dismissed. Lil Durk and OTF are left to carry the grief of that loss, while the public watches and demands a response. The digital communications in the days that follow capture the emotional devastation inside Durk's circle. The Piss Me Off video becomes a document of the anger in the morning that followed. Meanwhile, according to prosecutors, something else is being organized, a plan to reach the people connected to Von's death. Then, August 19, 2022, a group connected to Lil Durk, according to the government's theory, travels to Los Angeles and executes an ambush near the Beverly Center targeting Quando Rondo. Quando survives. His cousin, Xavier Robinson, known as Lil Pab, does not. He is shot through the torso and killed. The medical examiner's testimony about those injuries was presented to the jury in clinical detail that the courtroom absorbed in silence. Then October 2024, Lil Durk is arrested. The federal indictment follows, and eventually the trial begins in Los Angeles, in the same city where Lil Pab was killed, where a jury is now being asked to determine whether the night King Von died in Atlanta truly set all of this in motion. Now, this is where we got to address the central question this trial is ultimately asking. Was King Von's death the beginning of the retaliatory campaign prosecutors describe? Or is the government connecting events that are separated by nearly 2 years and filtered through cooperating witnesses whose accounts were developed across dozens of unrecorded meetings? That question does not have an obvious answer. It is the question the jury is being paid to resolve. The prosecution's theory is coherent and emotionally compelling. A close friend and collaborator is killed. The person associated with the shooting faces no legal consequences. The community expects a response. The defendant's own communications show he was devastated and feeling the pressure of that expectation. And then, nearly 2 years later, an organized attack is carried out against the camp connected to Von's death. The narrative thread is clear, and the government has built their case around making it feel inevitable. The defense's theory is equally coherent, but requires the jury to look more carefully at the specific actors rather than the emotional arc. Yes, Von died. Yes, Durk was devastated. But devastation is not conspiracy. The person who actually organized the logistics, Grant, according to the defense, had his own deep personal connection to Von, his own presence on the night Von died, and his own response to Von's dying question. And if Grant acted without Durk's authorization, then the government has the right tragedy and the wrong defendant. For y'all who haven't thought about what it means to hear someone's final words presented as courtroom evidence 6 years after they died, let me put that in perspective. King Von has been gone since November 2020. The people who loved him have spent nearly 6 years carrying that loss, building memorials, releasing tribute music, and trying to process an ending that came too early and too violently. And now, in a federal courtroom in Los Angeles, those final moments have been extracted from that grief and placed on the record as evidence. The question he asked Grant in his final moments, "Why did you let me get shot?" is being analyzed by attorneys, presented to jurors, and debated in the context of a murder-for-hire prosecution. Whatever that question meant in the moment Von asked it, it now means something different in a courtroom. And that transformation is one of the more unsettling dimensions of how this trial is unfolding. At the end of the day, the title of this documentary describes something real, even if it does not describe a single documented moment of Lil Durk weeping in front of the jury. The emotional breakdown is not a single event in that courtroom. It is the accumulated weight of sitting through a federal trial, where the worst night of your life is being used as the motive for a crime you say you did not commit, where the last words of someone you loved are being dissected by attorneys who never knew him, where the grief that you carried publicly and privately for years is now being presented to 12 strangers as evidence of your criminal intent. That is what breaking down in court actually looks like when you remove the dramatic framing and look at what is really happening in that room. It does not require a single visible moment of collapse. It does not require tears on camera or a moment that a courtroom sketch artist captures for the evening news. It just requires understanding what it means to sit there and listen, to hear the person you lost reduced to evidence, to hear their dying question read into the record, to hear 12 strangers evaluate what those words meant and whether they prove something about you. That is its own kind of breaking. Quiet, interior, and heavy in a way that does not photograph easily, but is no less real for the absence of documentation. The real question is whether that grief, that loss, and that connection to King Von ultimately proves what prosecutors say it proves, or whether the defense has done enough to convince the jury that they are looking at the wrong person for the wrong reasons. The answer to that question will determine whether Lil Durk walks out of that courthouse or spends the rest of his life inside the federal system that is now holding him accountable for a night that started with someone else's death nearly 6 years ago. And nearly 6 years after King Von asked his final question outside a hookah lounge in Atlanta, that question is still echoing, still shaping lives, still building legal arguments, still sitting at the center of a federal murder trial in a city hundreds of miles from where it was first spoken. Some nights do not end when the lights go out. They just keep going, pulling everyone connected to them further and further into consequences. Nobody standing outside that club in November 2020 could have seen coming. The courtroom in Los Angeles is still trying to decide what that night meant. And until the jury delivers its verdict, the answer belongs to no one. What are your thoughts on how King Von's final words are being used in this trial? And do you think the defense's strategy is strong enough to create reasonable doubt? Drop everything in the comments below and make sure you check out the content on screen for more on this case as it develops.